Your anatomy is a blueprint. You are an architect. Beneath your skin lie the plans for your fastest, strongest, most powerful self. If you can learn the structure of your skeleton, the makeup of your muscle, and the mechanics of movement, you can create your best possible body.
I'm Mike Robertson. This is Built by Science. If you're serious about building a complete physique, it really begins and ends with your legs. In my opinion, they may be the most important muscle group to hone and develop. And let's be honest, there's no way you can shortchange yourself. If you're not pushing it in the gym, there's no way you're going to develop the type of size and strength you're capable of without getting a great looking set of legs. And when you think about it, the legs are literally half the body, and there's 5 big muscle groups that we're going to cover here today. Your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, your adductors or groin muscles, as well as your calves. So there's a ton of real estate and a ton of information that we're going to cover in this video. With that being said, there's 4 areas that we want to cover with you guys here today. Number 1, we're going to cover the muscular anatomy like we just talked about. We're going to cover the skeletal anatomy, the bones and the joints involved in those movements. Third, we're going to show you the motions that your bones and joints and muscles work together to create. And then we're going to finish it off by showing you guys a few key exercises that we think best represent how your body should move when you're in the gym. We've selected IFBB Physique Pro Craig Capurso. He's going to help you guys better understand the anatomy and the function so that you can get the most out of your training in the gym. As I already alluded to, the legs are literally half of your body. We're going to cover 5 big muscle groups and 17 individual muscles in this episode. And if you ask me, there's no better place to start than what every guy wants to build. It's a great looking set of quads. So we got Craig here. Craig, if you just kind of relax here for me. Quads means 4 individual muscle groups. So you've got what's called your vastus lateralis, your vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and your rectus femoris. So we'll start with rectus femoris because it's unique. It actually starts at the top of your hip and comes all the way down and crosses your knee. It connects onto what's called your quad or patellar tendon. And this muscle is unique because it's the only one of your quad muscles that crosses your hip. From there, you've got what's called your vastus lateralis, and a lot of people want to talk about their outer thigh sweep. It comes from the top of your femur, comes all the way down across, and it also attaches to that quad or patellar tendon. From there, you've got your inner thigh, or that vastus medialis. And you guys can see, when we talk about a teardrop, I mean, Craig's like a perfect example of that. So that vastus medialis comes from the top of the thigh, comes all the way down and around, and attaches to his quad or patellar tendon. And then last but not least, you can't see it, but your vastus intermedius. It runs deep to your rectus femoris, and it comes all the way down and also attaches onto that quad or patellar tendon. So quadriceps, 4 muscles, obviously the biggest bulk of the front of your thigh. So when we talk about legs, you may have heard people talk about the term feathers. Craig's a great example here because you can see all the individual fibers. You can see how his fibers are pinnated. And that just means the angle of pination or the angle of his muscle fibers. So, I mean, he's a great example to look at. And when you're in the gym, you want to get after it. If you want to build a great looking set of quads, that's where you're going to look at a squat, a lunge, or even a leg extension type exercise. Now that we've covered the front of the thigh, let's take a look at the back. So I'm going to have Craig turn around. And keep in mind, I get it. If you want to get big, strong quads, that's cool. But make sure you're spending equal time developing the back. So when we're talking about the back, we're looking at the hamstrings. And there's 3 hamstring muscles, but don't be confused because the biceps femoris, the first one we're going to talk about, has 2 individual heads. So the biceps femoris runs from the ischial tuberosity, or essentially what's called your sit bone, comes down and attaches onto what's called your fibula, or one of your lower leg bones. So you have your long head, it only makes sense that you have a short head as well. So in this case, the short head runs from the back of your thigh, and it also comes down and attaches to the fibula. So biceps femoris, it's 1 muscle with 2 different heads. Now you also have 2 more hamstring muscles, and they're more on the inner portion of the thigh. you have what's called your semimembranosus, and it runs from the ischial tuberosity, comes down, and it attaches to your tibia, or your other lower leg bone. And the thing that helps me remember semimembranosus, it's more medial or closer to the midline relative to the third muscle, semitendinosus. And it runs from the ischial tuberosity, comes down, and it also attaches onto your tibia. Up to this point, we've covered the quads and we've covered the hamstrings. Now let's talk about another muscle group that people love to work on and sculpt, and that's your glutes. You've got 3 glute muscles, your glute max, your glute med, and your glute min. We're going to start with the glute max because that's the most obvious one and the one that most people are focusing their time on in the gym. Your glute max runs from your sacrum and your thoracolumbar fascia, which is essentially this big piece of connective tissue. And it comes down and attaches onto what's called your IT band or your iliotibial band, which is another big piece of connective tissue, and it runs down and crosses your knee joint. So that's one attachment. It also comes down and attaches onto the outer portion of your thigh. So when people are talking about glutes, most often they're talking about their glute max. So now let's take a look at the glute med. Craig, if you can give me a quarter turn here. A lot of times people don't hear about the glute med or the glute min because they are deeper muscles. You can't see them, so most people think they're not important. But your glute med is actually a very critical stabilizer of your hip and your thigh. So your glute med, if you can imagine, runs along the top of your iliac crest here, or the top of your hip bone, comes down and it attaches onto your outer thigh. Even deeper to that is your glute min, and it's a very small muscle right here on the outer portion of your hip, and it also comes down and attaches onto the outer portion of your thigh. So don't forget, when you're training your legs, when you're training your hips, you've got 3 glute muscles: glute max, glute medius, and glute minimus. The next muscle group we're going to talk about are called your adductors. Now, a lot of people maybe aren't familiar with these, or they don't realize just how important these small muscle groups are. So you actually got 5 adductor muscles that we're going to cover here today. All of them start on what's called your pubis, or if you can imagine kind of the inside of your hip, that's where your pubis is. So they all come off this pubis and come down and attach to the inside of your thigh. So the first one is called your pectineus. It comes down and across and attaches to the top of your thigh. Second, you have what's called your adductor brevis, and brevis just means short, so it comes down and across and attaches below the pectineus. Third, you have your adductor longus, so again, running from the pubis, comes down. So you guys can imagine how these are almost layered in fashion. Fourth, and one I want you guys to make note of, the adductor magnus. It's probably the biggest adductor. It runs from your pubis, comes down, and it attaches not only to the inside of your thigh, but a little bit lower down as well. And that makes your adductor magnus quite unique. Last but not least, you've got a long, skinny muscle called your gracilis, and it runs from your pubis, comes all the way down, and attaches to the tibia, or the inside of your lower leg bone. So we covered 5 big adductor muscles: pectineus, adductor brevis, adductor longus, adductor magnus, and gracilis. And what's important, I don't want you guys to confuse these with the quads or the hamstrings. They're absolutely important for bulk and width, front to back, side to side of your thighs, but they are unique, and we're going to make sure that we try and use some exercises to develop these muscles in their own right. Last but not least, we're going to look at the calves, or the lower leg muscles. I'm going to have Craig go ahead and turn around here, and there's essentially 2 muscle groups that we're interested in developing: your gastrocnemius and your soleus. With your gastrocnemius, it's unique because it crosses your knee joint. So you have what's called a lateral head of your gastroc, and you also have a medial head, and both of those heads converge or come down and attach to your Achilles tendon. Deep to that gastroc, you have what's called your soleus. And your soleus attaches to your tibia and your fibula, those 2 lower leg bones, and it also comes down and attaches onto the Achilles tendon. So 2 muscles, one crosses the knee, but both attach to the Achilles tendon and help create plantar flexion, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. So we've covered a lot of ground in this video. 5 big muscle groups and 17 individual muscles. Just as a quick recap, you got your calves, you got your hamstrings, the big muscles on the back of your thigh. You got your glutes, or your butt muscles for lack of a better term. If we spin Craig around, you got your quads, the big guys on the front of the thigh, and then if he turns his thigh outward just a little bit, you get a good look at the adductors, or those inner thigh muscles. So we spent a lot of time covering the muscles. Now let's jump into the bones and joints involved in creating all these different movements. Now that we've covered the muscular anatomy, let's take a look at the individual bones and joints that work together in your lower body and your hips to create motion. The first bone that I want to talk about is called your pelvis. And if you imagine on both sides of your body, you've got a pelvis, and it kind of works like a bowl to shape and tie everything together. So your pelvis is a really critical structure. Within your pelvis, coming on down, you've got your femur, or your big thigh bone. Working our way down even further, you've got your big lower leg bone, which is called your tibia, and that's kind of the meatier of the two. It's right here in the front. And last but not least, you've got this smaller bone called your fibula. And while most people don't talk about it, it only absorbs about 10% of your body weight. So when most people are talking about their lower leg, they're typically talking about the tibia versus the fibula. Now that you have a better understanding of the bones, let's see how they all work together to create joints, which will help us create movement. I'm going to have Craig go ahead and give me a quarter turn again. And when you think about your pelvis, it's really simple. It's got 2 basic motions. It's got what's called anterior tilt, or rolling the hips forward, and it's got what's called posterior tilt, where he rolls the hips back and underneath him. So the pelvis is fairly straightforward. But from there, you've got your hip joint, and your hip is essentially your thigh bone coming into this socket here. So it's what's called a ball and socket joint. And at that ball and socket joint, you have tons of freedom of motion. If you can imagine, you can do all these different movements. So Craig can flex his hip, he can extend his hip, abduct it, adduct it, internally and externally rotate it. So that's important to note. Hip joint is a centerpiece for your body because it has so much mobility. Moving down, you got your knee joint. Primarily, when you're thinking about your knee, you've got knee flexion, or pulling your leg back like you would in a hamstring curl, and you've got knee extension like you would in a squat, a deadlift, or a leg extension. Last but not least, if we come down to your ankle joint, your ankle primarily has 2 basic motions. It's got what's called plantar flexion, like you would when you come up on your toes to do a calf raise, and you have what's called dorsiflexion, and that's where you would pull your toes back up towards your face. So far, we've covered the muscles, the bones, and the joints that are all involved in creating movement through your hips, your thighs, and your lower leg. But what's even more important, I want you guys to have a really strong understanding of how you take all these individual pieces and put them together to create seamless, fluid movement. And that's what we're going to cover in our next section. In this video, we've covered the muscles of your hips, legs, and thighs. We've covered the joints, and we've covered the individual movements that those create. But what's really important is tying this all together. I want to show you guys how this works when you're functioning in the gym doing some of your favorite exercises. Now, keep in mind, as we're going through this stuff, in no way, shape, or form is it indicative of the kind of intensity that you're going to use when you're in the gym. In fact, Craig right now, he's not happy with us. He wants 2 1/4 on the bar, but we're going to do it light. We're going to show you guys great technique so that when you go in the gym, you're doing everything right. The first exercise we're going to demonstrate is a front squat. So Craig's going to go ahead and set himself up. Now keep in mind, when you're front squatting, you're typically not going to walk the bar forward out of the rack. You're going to walk backwards and stay in the rack. But again, for demonstration purposes, we're going to set it up this way. So Craig's going to set the bar high up on his throat. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but this is the best place to have the bar. As he walks it out, he's going to set up with his feet about hip, shoulder width apart, toes turned out very slightly. And then from this position, all he's going to do, keep the weight about mid-foot to the heel, and he's going to sit back and push the knees out. The cool thing about front squat, it's going to hit almost every muscle in your lower leg. You can tell as he's lowering down, he's really lengthening the quads. As he stands up, He's going to extend the knee, and he's really going to hit those quads hard. But it's not just quads.